they were asking him about the partition because that was what he was primarily known for. And he said something that struck me as very intriguing. And he said, Jinnah, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, is the reason this happened at all, but no one talks about him anymore. It's like they've put him out of the narrative when he was the reason this happened. The thing about Gandhi that struck me is that he was very much wary of industrialization and urbanization. And he was very much in love with village India, or an idea of village India. Gandhi, first of all, he never had intercourse with his niece or his nieces. He never had intercourse. The whole point was for him to lay there next to a young female and experience nothing. Can I experience nothing? If I do experience something, can I overcome it with my mind? And am I stronger than my own desires? Am I stronger than lust? Am I truly an ascetic?
Hi, Namaste Amit. Welcome on the Awaara Musaafir show. It's a huge honor and pleasure for me to have you on the podcast and talk about the partition, talk about the book. I'll just show the book to the audience. This is the book, The Map and the Scissors. Firstly, talking about the book, this is a really good book, like a page turner. This was the first actually the historical fiction which I've read about the partition. So something really amazing.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me on. I'm very honored to be part of your growing roster of very interesting guests, looking in your archive with some great listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, we'll talk about the book. Firstly, how did you come up with this idea, like talking about lives of Jinnah and Gandhi specifically? Why did you pick these two, legendary figures from that time?
So I've actually published historical fiction about partition in the past. So in 2011, my first novel that I ever got published was called Partitions, and it was more about the struggles of everyday people at this time. And there were no major political figures that were a part of that novel. It was just about regular folks. And then I was always still fascinated by this period, and I would periodically read things about the partition. And one time I found an interview with Lord Mountbatten this is in the 1970s. He died in I think 1979 in an IRA bombing, actually, of a yacht. But before that, immediately before that, they were asking him about the partition because that was what he was primarily known for. And he said something that struck me as very intriguing. And he said, Jinnah, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, is the reason this happened at all, but no one talks about him anymore. It's like they've put him out of the narrative when he was the reason this happened. And I realized that when I thought about the partition and when I thought about the major figures of the partition, there were, Gandhi was obviously very, very, in the foreground of my thinking, and Sardar Patel and Jawaharlal Nehru and Mountbatten himself. And I realized that there was a way in which Jinnah had been memory holed, even in my understanding of it, and I'd been reading about it for years. And this led me to research Jinnah very extensively. And the first version of this book, which is a completely different book, I have it in my archives, maybe I'll publish it someday, was something called I, Jinnah. And that was a novel that purported to be the autobiography of Muhammad Ali Jinnah.
Oh, wow.
Okay. And that book has its own charm and its own fascination. And because, Gandhi left an autobiography, Nehru talked about himself as well. Jinnah, very strangely, he never left any autobiographical material. Right. He's very, very businesslike all the time. He has tons of speeches, but he never just sits down and says, this is my life. This is how I saw things. This is my perspective on all these events and people. So I initially wrote I wrote a whole novel that was called I, Jinnah. It was an autobiography in the voice of Jinnah. But I felt that it was not doing enough to become dramatic, to become a page turner, like you were saying. And I said, what this book needs is not simply to take the biographical material and then turn it into an autobiography or to give one perspective. Drama results from conflict. And if the conflict has to be personal, it has to be interpersonal. And I thought, who is the Jinnah's opposite number? Who is the foil to Jinnah? Who is, everything Jinnah is, who is the opposite of that? And the answer was very obvious. The answer was Gandhi. And they had opposing philosophies of what should happen to British India. And their personalities were in some ways very similar, but in some ways profoundly different as well. And as soon as I thought that, I was like, oh, there you go. And so the original title of The Map and the Scissors was Jinnah versus Gandhi was the original title of it. But that title has already been taken by a book of essays written in 2010, published in 2010. It was only published in India, so I'd never seen it. And my publisher told me, we love the book, we want to publish the book, but we can't use this title. And so I came up with a whole list of titles, and this was the one that everyone liked the most. So really, it was it was started with an interview with Mountbatten that sent me down the Jinnah rabbit hole. And then from there, it was just a question of finding the right form. And the right form was dramatizing the rivalry between Jinnah and Gandhi.
Right. So you mentioned Jinnah rabbit hole, and there's this friend of mine, and she reads a lot about Jinnah. And I asked her, like, why Jinnah specifically? And she used this exact term: when you start reading about Jinnah, it's a rabbit hole. You just keep going in deeper into it for some reason, because maybe he had some kind of swagger. And in your book as well, I could, from the way he talks, or like you have portrayed him, you can see that there's this guy, a perfect gentleman. He eats pork, he loves his whiskey, and he goes on to, make a Islamic nation, which is just, that just blows my mind. So was like partition, or like the idea of Pakistan, always there in his mind, or was it something like as he got better with his politics and stuff happened, then he got that idea?
So it wasn't his idea. So I think it's important to remember that for the majority of his career, majority of his life, no one had invented the idea of Pakistan yet. And so today we have bloggers and social media influencers and things like that, or people on Substack who might throw out an idea, right? In those days, they did it in the form of pamphlets. So there was Rahmat Ali Chaudhry, who was this expatriate London-dwelling student, and he basically came up with this idea that we should divide the subcontinent. And at that point, this is in the early 30s. So Jinnah has been working for decades, trying to mediate between the All India Muslim League, which advocated specifically for Muslim interests, and then the Indian National Congress, which had a vision of everyone living together in harmony. And he was a failure. It was a failure. He couldn't manage to do this because there were a lot of sort of schemes that we would today consider ridiculous. So communal veto, that means that if Muslims decide that they don't want some law, then that's it, it's over. Or a voting system in which a Muslim vote counts for 1.5 Hindu votes. So, a differential ratio. They had all sorts of ideas that today, and even then, everyone was like, yeah, that's never going to work. That's unfair. That's not right. And so there was no way to really reconcile all of this. And so Jinnah, at the time that the idea for Pakistan even arises, as I show in the book, he has given up on politics. He's moved to London. He's moved to England. He's living in England, practicing law. And everyone knows that he's the best there is for a certain type of political advocacy. And they come to him and they say that, look, there's no real solution within the bounds of a constitutional democracy. We want our own country. And if we don't, we're going to be relatively powerless. Not necessarily true, by the way, we can talk about that in a moment, but basically then it becomes, okay, so what am I going to do? Am I going to take us down this pathway, or am I going to continue to advocate in some other way? And as late as 1937, which is just 10 years before the actual partition, he's not fully advocating Pakistan yet. And they have legislative assembly elections, which is because, the British gave the forms of democracy in an early or pre-independence India. They had the forms of democracy. They would have elections, and Congress got more of the Muslim vote than Jinnah's All India Muslim League. And so at that point, Jinnah realized that, look, I need to do something to basically break the fascination that Gandhi, Nehru, the Indian National Congress have over everyone, including my co-religionists.
Right.
And the only way he could do that was by sowing division, sowing distrust, and basically, the norms of rhetoric were very different back then. Today, if someone said some of the things about a religious community that, say, Jinnah said, we would consider them to be, beyond the pale of acceptable discourse. But back then, it was the 1930s, and you could say things about groups. The norms were different. Yeah. We have to remember that. That's why Hitler could say things about the Jews. That's why, different people could say things about different nationalities. It was very, very different time. And so Jinnah used those rhetorical freedom to basically convince Muslims that if British India became one big country, that would be a catastrophe for them, and that they should basically advocate for that they should join him in demanding Pakistan. And so over the next 10 years, he brought that community to where he was, and that was how he increased his power, and that was how he increased success. And really, in politics, it is easier to divide people and to unite them against something rather than to unite them for something. Gandhi was trying to unite all these different people for something, for an idea of India. And then Jinnah was able to basically do the opposite. And that's another way in which they were opposite. Their final trajectories politically became very, very diametrically opposed.
Right. But then, like in India, there are a lot of groups, and every group has a certain ideology or thoughts about Gandhi. And Gandhi's politics was something like, it confuses me even now, because you just can't put a finger on what he was exactly wanting at that time. So can you talk about that? Like, can you explain what was Gandhi's politics?
So Gandhi's politics, obviously, he has volumes of essays. He was always writing about various ideas. Okay. And there's so many ways in which you can answer that question, because he opined about so many different things over the course of his decades-long life. But I will tell you the crux of the issue is that he had two elements of his vision for India that need to be remembered. One is that he wanted a national identity to supersede both caste identity and religious identity. Okay. So right now, if you look at Indians, if you look at, they have different caste identities that they're very proud of. They have religious identities that they'll, in some cases, commit violence for. Yeah. And those are the identities that he wanted to override by saying, okay, we're all Indians now, right? And that is point number one that's important to remember. And I think the other point that often gets forgotten, I think that first point is something that a lot of people know about and a lot of people remember and think of when they think of Gandhi. Oh, if you divide India, you'll be tearing my heart in two, and that sort of rhetoric and those sort of sentiments. I think the other thing about Gandhi that struck me is that he was very much wary of industrialization and urbanization. And he was very much in love with village India, or an idea of village India. And he wanted to prevent, at this point, at 1940s, India is a very urbanized country already. Yeah. Okay. There's massive cities all over the place. And increasingly, it's increasing its industrialization as well. It's not it's not an industrialized economy at that point, but a lot of Gandhi's benefactors are actually industrialists. So like when he passed away at Birla House. Who was Birla? Birla was a guy who was in textiles. He had textile factories. And he had various other, very, very wealthy patrons who were, part of the nascent industrialization of India. But to go back to my point is that he had a vision of India maintaining its character. And this is in part, this is related to a London educated lawyer's notion of what India was and is, but that there would be a way in which India would not become a third-rate imitation of the West. Okay. He did not want India becoming England. And he
Right.
was, and this was something that really concerned him to the point where it altered how he dressed. It altered how he spoke. It altered everything. And there's and I'll tell you a very, very interesting thing. The earliest recording of Gandhi's voice, he has a more British accent than he did at the very end of his life. He overcame his own anglicized accent when he spoke English. Right. And he became, he emphasized the sort of Indian accent, which is a very interesting thing if you think about it.
Yeah, yeah.
Jinnah made no such alteration other than a very superficial. Last 10 years of his, he'll put on the Karakul cap and he'll put on a little, kameez or whatever. Occasionally, he'll have a photo taken like that. But he gave speeches in English, and he had very immaculate anglicized English, and he wore 3-piece suits that he had tailored in London. So that's another major difference between Jinnah and Gandhi that I noticed.
Yeah. And in fact, the first point that you talked about in Gandhi's perspective, wasn't Jinnah's, the plan about Pakistan in a way similar? Like he also wanted a Pakistan where there was no religion. People rose above the religion, above the caste. And he actually made statements as well about that. If you are a citizen of Pakistan, you are a Pakistani first and then everything. So was partition like that necessary then?
The question was partition necessary is a separate question. The first part of the question answer would have to relate to Jinnah's statements about religious equality in Pakistan. And there is because Jinnah never really opened up about exactly what he thought or left an autobiography or anything like that. Yeah. There are a lot of contradictory theories about what Jinnah really thought inside. And so if you talk to some people, they'll say, oh, Jinnah was just using the idea of Pakistan as a bargaining chip in order to gain concessions from the British. There's other people who say, no, he always wanted to basically create a religious ethno-state at the expense of the Hindus. The truth may be somewhere in between, where he basically wanted to create a Muslim majority country without necessarily purging all of the minorities in the way that modern day West Pakistan has done. Basically, a country in which Muslims collectively would have a demographic advantage over Hindus. Basically, was the principle. Once Muslims have a greater than 70 or 75% dominance over the Hindu population, then they don't have to worry about Hindus voting as a bloc and basically dominating the Muslims, basically. Right. That was his underlying idea. So he never intended for all the Hindus to leave. And in fact, when he was discussing with the British, as I made the point of putting this in the book, he had something called hostage theory. He's like, look, I want to have 15% Hindus, and I want them to have, I want to have 10% Hindus. I want them over in India to have 10% Muslims. If they do anything to Muslims that I don't like, I'm going to do the exact same thing to my Hindus, and then we'll both just basically be like, okay, we'll stop. Yeah. And the British told him that this was crazy, but he fully intended to have a hostage population of Hindus in Pakistan. Basically, that was part of the plan of Pakistan, is that I will have a certain number of Hindus in the country, and they will be my hostages, as it were, right, on behalf of the Muslims in India, and that will sort of maintain the peace that way. You know what I'm saying? We'll maintain the peace that way. However, as it turned out, the Hindus fled Pakistan because the Hindus in the region of Pakistan, West Pakistan, not East Pakistan, that's a separate story, but West Pakistan, they were primarily urban. They were primarily moneyed, meaning they had money, all right? And they basically were mobile. So it's kind of like when you try and tax multimillionaires. What do? They move somewhere where the taxes are lower, right? If you persecute rich people, they're like, see ya, I'm out. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah,
So to this day, the Hindu population, the rump Hindu population in Pakistan is primarily very lower caste and poor people. All right. And the very wealthy people, the people who built Karachi's Hindu Gymkhana, right? And the various people who ran businesses in the port cities like Karachi or in major
yeah,
centers in urban centers in India or in Pakistan, they just fled to India, they fled to Britain, they fled to America, they fled different places. And so there was a massive capital flight from Pakistan as well. Okay.
Hmm.
It wasn't just population that drained out of that country. Capital drained out of it too, because it was like, it's the same thing that happened to Poland when Poland purged its Jews in the 1940s, right? The Jews were the money men. They were rich and they were good merchants and they built the economy and they sustained the economy. And then they basically turn on these people. Same thing happened to Turkey in the 1950s when they got rid of the Greek Orthodox population. Look up the Istanbul pogroms, all right? That was another example. And this is just the unexpected or rather unforeseen consequences. People or communities that do this to their religious minorities think that I will simply take everything they have and then we will be rich the way they are rich.
yeah,
That's not how it works in real life. That's not how it works that's not how economies work. You know what I'm saying? Economies are based on network, capital, credit. Those are the things. And you destroy the people in whom that adheres, you make them go somewhere else. Guess what? Other countries benefit. Other countries benefit. Other countries get the capital, they get the credit, they get the networks, and you're left with a crumbling Haveli that you took over. You know what I'm saying? Like that's what you're left with. And so those are things that Jinnah and the people who advocated partition didn't understand, and that's the things that people who persecute religious minorities don't understand, that it doesn't end well. It doesn't end well for anyone. It doesn't end well for anyone.
Got it. So, and then coming back to the second question, which was about, was partition necessary? Especially, we are recording on 14th August and it's, Partition Horrors Day, Remembrance Day. So, was partition necessary? Could we have stopped all of those, the atrocities and the whole migration? Could we have stopped that?
So here's the hard reality is that by 1947, okay, a lot of rhetoric had been flying everywhere, and a lot of people had already died at that point. Okay, and there was hysteria too. There was hysteria on the part of, if they turn this into a single country, we're going to be outnumbered. They're going to persecute us. This, that, the other, and so it's important to remember that the territory that was the British Raj was never really one political unit historically. Okay, even the large empires, didn't necessarily contain both Kanyakumari and Kashmir, and Peshawar and Dhaka. Like all those areas are typically not a single empire. And even when historians color the map all one color, like, oh look, this is the Gupta Empire or this is this empire, it was actually local power centers that basically ran things, and then there'd be some nominal tribute that would go to the center. And it's important not to think that British India was all one thing, because at that time there was 557 independent or 550 something independent principalities that were basically just giving some tribute to the British, kneeling in the darbar and then doing their own thing. And so was partition necessary? By 1947, if you hadn't partitioned India, there would have been secessionist movements. And whether the Indian army could have suppressed them, whether they could have ended them, is open question. No one knows that. But there would have been bloodshed no matter what. And there'd already been bloodshed before 1947. Now, if you say, could you have avoided partition in 1937 or in 1927 or in 1917? Better chance at that, because the rhetoric and propaganda had not yet activated segments of the population against the idea of one big country. At that time, when they said Azadi, they were just like, yeah, get the British out of here. Let's all be one country.
Right.
If you look at 1917, for example, and that was the year of the Lucknow. That was, I think, 1916 or 17 was the year of the Lucknow Pact. Jinnah actually brokered some deals. All right. At that time, even Jinnah would have been on board. Yeah, get the British out. We'll be a one big country. How long would that have lasted? Again, we can't run the experiment again. You could say hypothetically, the British had quit India in 1917, and Jinnah becomes a member of a cabinet. Maybe, you know, Nehru's father is prime minister instead of Nehru, right?
Yeah.
And Gandhi has some role, you know, as an advisor for the future of India. Let's say that's a hypothetical alternative history. How long does that last? How long before someone comes along and says, hey, look, the Hindus are dominating everything? Or someone else says, oh, look, this particular caste is dominating everything. Or they say, oh, look, the North Indians are dominating everything, and the South Indians, we don't have enough say. How long before separatist movements arise? You know, you don't know. And there's a good chance that, you know, India would have broken up one way or the other. And at that point, you don't know whether it would have broken up into very many multiple smaller countries, which would have been, you know, a problem from the perspective of, you know, each one of those countries being weaker and more susceptible to foreign manipulation. And that is a dream that some people still have for India, for example, even now, divided up into smaller bite-sized portions, and then play one off against each other and make them client states. Basically. India and Pakistan, India, 1947 borders, India, stuck together in part because it had Pakistan to be the enemy and to unite against, oh, look, we're India, they're Pakistan, right? Because you can unite against something much better, right? And so Indian patriotism is not independent of the existence of Pakistan. You take Pakistan out of the equation entirely, all of a sudden Indians look around at each other and realize that, hey, I don't have that much in common with, you know, someone in Tamil Nadu realizes they don't have that much in common with someone in Delhi, and someone from various castes realize that, you know, that caste has nothing to do with me. Religion, hey, they're Hindu, they're Sikh, they're Muslim, you know, that all the divisions arise again. Pakistan's internal narrative is very much, you know, anti-India, bi-transitive, anti-Hindu, to be honest with you. And it was only 1971 where linguistic and geographic gulf led to the formation of Bangladesh. But think about how big that gulf was between the two halves of Pakistan. 1947 Pakistan had these two halves that were separated by territory, separated by language, and had drastically different Hindu populations. West Pakistan had nearly 1% at that point. East Pakistan had a very thriving Hindu community and a thriving and culturally and politically not marginalized community either. And in academia, journalism, politics, culture, it was one of the things that the West Pakistanis complained about. They thought that East Pakistan was too Hindu for its own good. And so basically, you know, those gulfs of demographics, geography, and language led Pakistan to divide into Pakistan and Bangladesh. You know, and so that's basically you know, what happened to Pakistan. It could have very easily have happened to India. It could happen to India even now. You know, it could happen to India even now. India is one of the few countries that has different language families within it. All right, the Dravidian language family, the Indo-European language family. These are totally different, you know, language families. Very rare to see that. In the United States, where I live, you have English and Spanish are the two main languages, but they're very similar. They have very similar ancestry. They're the same language family. You know, they're written in the same script, right? They're both written in the Roman script. In India, you have different language families and multiple different scripts. It's a very unusual situation. I feel like Indians don't understand how unusual their country is. It's almost like they take these things for granted. They take it for granted that, you know, someone in, you know, a Malayali person can't understand what the Prime Minister of India is saying. You know,
Yeah.
Prime Minister of India cannot communicate with, someone from Tamil Nadu who doesn't speak English. Can't
Yeah.
communicate. You don't speak English, you don't speak Hindi, you don't speak Gujarati. I can't communicate with you. That's an unusual situation, and I think people they take it for granted. But those are all fault lines that could be exploited at some point in the future. They could rupture open at some point in the future. But as long as there's Pakistan, there will be India.
Got it. So, I have always thought about this the other way around, that Pakistan's existence is because of India, but you bring up this really interesting point. So, do you think India has stayed united till now just because of Pakistan, like because we know there's a common enemy?
Not just because of that. I don't think that that's sufficient, but I do think that it is. It helps. I do think it helps. And I think that has to do with just the nature of the human mind. Okay. The human mind is tribal. Why did India's Muslims decide to vote for Pakistan? Why did they decide that they needed, that they should demand Pakistan? They're, a Muslim majority country. It was a tribal mentality, right? Now, Indians of various backgrounds, it's not that easy to unite them for something. It's much easier to unite them against something, And so it's not the only reason that everyone's, all in one country, but it does help. It's just the nature of the human mind. Okay. Nature of the human mind. And I feel that, in the future, hypothetically, if Pakistan ceased to be a credible threat, India's unity would be weaker because they would start looking at internal divisions rather than regional divisions. But that's a hypothesis. I think that just based on human psychology, it helps. I don't think it's the only reason though.
Yeah, got it. So, and coming back to the book, coming back to Gandhi. So as I was talking to you, like, this is very weird to bring up this topic, especially about Gandhi, because still he's like the father figure in India, and people have emotional connects with him. So you have mentioned in books his weird sexual kinks. Can you talk about those? Because I actually had an idea about all of these things, but I never believed. And once I read this book, I went out and I researched a bit, and I found out a lot of things. So can you talk about this?
Oh yeah, so I think that Gandhi was both a political figure, but he was also a religious figure, and he was very much about experimenting with various ways of basically pursuing asceticism. So he swore off intercourse with his wife after having had several children. He swore off intercourse with his wife, and why would someone do that? Why would he, stop doing that, even though he still had, urges? And the reason is that because within the Indian tradition, within the Hindu tradition, there's the tradition of the ascetic. The ascetic controls or restrains desire and restrains kama, right? Kama. So you basically have a figure like Gandhi, who is simultaneously engaged in political activity. He's also engaged in religious activity, all right? And religious thought. And a big part of being an ascetic, of dressing very simply, having almost no possessions. At the end of his life, he had about 5 or 6 possessions, his glasses, his paduka, right? Part of that poverty, part of that dressing very simply, eating, being a fruitarian, eating only fruit and water, going on, having fasts. Part of that also is restraining kama, restraining your lusts, restraining your desires. And so what we tend to forget is that Gandhi, first of all, he never had intercourse with his niece or his nieces. He never had intercourse. The whole point was for him to lay there next to a young female and experience nothing. Can I experience nothing? If I do experience something, can I overcome it with my mind? And am I stronger than my own desires? Am I stronger than lust? Am I truly an ascetic or not? And this is something that is weird to all of us, but it is important to remember that Gandhi himself didn't just write about it. He wasn't just open about it. He wanted Manu Gandhi herself to write about it.
Yeah.
And he encouraged her. He said, I want you to write about how, what we did, rather what we didn't do, and what I was able to do, and how I was able to basically conquer desire. He actually wanted her to write about it. And he wanted all of this to be public. And Jawaharlal Nehru was very, very uncomfortable with that coming out. He felt that it had political ramifications, which inevitably it would. And there is evidence that basically there was documentation about this from Manu Gandhi that was destroyed. And it was generally suppressed because India, even then, had sort of neo-Victorian morality. And then even to this day, it's not something that people feel comfortable talking about. It's not something people really want to talk. It's a weird thing. All right. And you can be a really big fan of Gandhi and still understand that he had some weird streaks. He was also obsessed with giving himself enemas, right? Who wants to talk about Gandhi giving himself enemas? Even I don't talk about that, but he was very, very fixated on his bowel movements as well, right? And that's because he didn't have these very, very finicky boundaries about like, can't talk about this, can't talk about that. He was the ultimate, I wrote a children's book earlier this year called Heroes the Color of Dust, also about Gandhi. It's a children's book. It's about sparrows who become a bodyguard for Gandhi on the Salt March. And at the end of that book, I have a little I have like a little essay where I explain to kids what Gandhi was like. And the analogy that I drew was that he was like a modern day influencer. Okay, a modern day influencer who shares every little bit of his life online, right? There are people today, you go on YouTube, you go on Instagram, they're sharing every little thing that they do, every moment of their life, all an open book, because they want the connection and they want attention and they want to get message out, they want to do this and they want to draw you in and they want to share with you what their experiences are. Hey, look, I'm doing intermittent fasting and it's really working. I'm doing high intensity interval training and it's really working, and so for Gandhi, he's always talking about his diets. He was always talking about, he was talking about all sorts of personal stuff as well, because he was the sort of like the ancestor of the modern day influencer. And if you look at the way he manipulated the media with the Salt March being, I'm going to march here, I'm going to put salt, I'm going to hold this salt up for the camera. You know what I'm saying? So he made sure the cameras were rolling. He understood the nature of media well in advance, 100 years in advance of modern day influencers. He understood the nature of footage. He understood the nature of the viral moment. All right. And that was part of his strength, because he was, cameras and newsreels hadn't been around for that long. And not been manipulated by anybody as effectively as Gandhi manipulated them. And that's why we're still talking about him today. You know what I'm saying?
So you mean to say like there was an ulterior motive for all of these things? It was a political motive?
Political motive for what?
For
like Salt March absolutely has a political motive.
Yeah, no, but not Salt March, like all his the personal kinks and the enemas, the sexual kinks, everything.
Not necessarily for that stuff. That he's just trying to basically test himself. And basically, when I'm talking about he has a motive for doing the Salt March and making sure the cameras are rolling, he's basically that's very much a political gesture. I don't think that his sexual experiments on himself were necessarily had a political motive, simply because again, he was more than politics. He was also had a very strong religious streak. And we can't reduce Gandhi purely to a politician. Jinnah was very much a political creature inside and out. And he was not a particularly religious person, even in spite of revisionist history. He wasn't particularly religious. Gandhi had a whole other side of religiosity that was very, very prominent, very, very real, very, very genuine. And he wrote a commentary on the Gita, you know, he
Yeah.
used to have prayer meetings every day, you know, so Gandhi is kind of like a larger, he has different regions to his life. Jinnah is, I wouldn't say one-dimensional, but he is very much single-minded. He's very single-minded is the right word.
Got it. So, why couldn't, Gandhi and Jinnah work it out? Was it because of Nehru, and Gandhi's, preference for Nehru, like his love for Nehru?
I don't think that was necessarily what it was. I think that they just had, basically by 1947, they had irreconcilable visions. So they were never going to work it out. And Jinnah at that point didn't want to work it out, you know? So
Right.
he was like, I'm the sole spokesperson for all of the British Raj as Muslims, and anyone who, who says otherwise is not speaking for this particular religious group. I'm the only one. And Gandhi and the Congress insisted that, look, we have Muslim members, we have Maulana Azad, we have this, that, the other. We want to speak for everybody. That in itself is a fundamental divide. That in itself is something that you say, either you're the sole spokesperson or you're not,
Right.
And Gandhi said, and the Indian National Congress said, you're not. And Jinnah said, I am. And, the Congress said, one India. And Jinnah said, India and Pakistan. You're not going to reconcile this at that point.
Got it.
So yeah, it wasn't Nehru specifically who had anything to do with that.
Got it. So, and coming towards, the end of this podcast, I had few questions about the British Raj. So, when we look at the partition, and people have always said this, that since the time they first came to India, they had started dividing India through the history books, through the ideology and everything. So, what was their motive behind the partition, and how did they play both, the Congress and the all India Muslim League? How did they play both of them?
That's very interesting, because it's an interesting question, interesting way of phrasing the question. And what I've noticed when I hear Indians talk about the partition, and I hear Indians talk about the British Raj, one thing I've noticed is that the memory holding of Jinnah and the centering of the British Raj as the motive force behind the partition of the subcontinent, those are two related phenomena. All right.
Okay.
You can only demonize the British Empire as the reason, the ones who partitioned India, if you conveniently forget that Jinnah ever existed, if you conveniently forget that the All India Muslim League relentlessly advocated for this and threatened civil war if they didn't get it. Okay. And so literally in The Guardian, just 2 days ago, I saw a front page, big splashy article. And the headline was, "The British Empire caused the bloodshed," was the big headline. Okay. I probably have a screenshot of it somewhere, because I was like, this is a little piece of evidence in a larger issue here. So basically, here, I can show it to you right here. I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that? It says,
it's not clear.
There.
Yeah, now it is.
Yeah, the British Empire, the British Raj caused the bloodshed. So that's The Guardian, okay? And it's written by Aina J. Khan and Taslima Begum, right? And that's a very interesting statement to me, because that's only partly, or it's only partly true, and it's perhaps more untrue than it is true, because if you look at the transcripts of the discussions that the British had, 1945, 1946, 1947, those transcripts exist. Those transcripts exist where Jinnah is saying Pakistan, and the British are saying, that's crazy. That's not going to work.
Seriously?
Yes, those transcripts exist. Mountbatten told Jinnah. There's a reason Mountbatten thought of Jinnah as a psychopath, because he constantly told him that, look, this is not going to work. This is going to be a disaster. There's going to be bloodshed. All right. And the British were not interested in that whole process of partitioning the subcontinent, because where do you draw the line? For example, one question. How do you split up a country like that anyway? And basically the British had to be sort of pressured into doing it. And the people doing the pressuring was primarily Jinnah. And that's why, as I said at the beginning of the interview, at the beginning of the podcast, Mountbatten had that interview where he said, look, Jinnah's primarily the reason this happened. All right. Jinnah's the reason, but no one talks about it. The reason no one talks about Jinnah is because they want to just talk about the British Raj. Did the British Raj, is it innocent? Absolutely not. All right. Absolutely not. They were exhausted after World War II. So when they did this thing that they knew was going to cause havoc in Punjab and Bengal, all right, Gandhi didn't attend Independence Day celebrations. He went to Bengal to prevent further bloodshed because he knew bloodshed was going to happen. So the whole idea that we're Nehru, Jinnah, everyone's like, oh, I didn't know there was going to be bloodshed. They're lying. Everyone was talking about it happening. The British themselves had a Punjab boundary force that they didn't fund it properly. They didn't staff it properly. It was completely overwhelmed, right? So the British is like, if you're going to partition it, you have to invest people and money and equipment in making sure that it doesn't turn into a bloodbath. They didn't do that, all right? Because they'd just come out of the Battle of Britain and the invasions of Normandy, and they were done, all right? They were wiped out, basically, all right? Their fighting forces, massive casualties of World War II. This is happening right after World War II. It's perhaps a little bit much to expect them to suddenly go over to this colony that they don't necessarily even think of as their equals. I mean, I don't think that at that point British people necessarily thought of Indians as fully human or fully their equals. Certainly not. In the aggregate, I don't think white Britishers necessarily thought that about Indians. To expect them to invest a massive amount in their extrication from something like the British Raj or the colony of India, perhaps too much to expect. But in the end, it wasn't the British going around hacking people to death or committing rapes and murders or burning villages. Indians did that. Pakistanis did that, right? And so to say the British Raj caused the bloodshed is a way of avoiding shame and guilt and taking it onto the acceptable, shifting all of that onto the acceptable recipient for it, because even British people don't defend the British Empire anymore, all right? Even British people are like, oh, our empire was evil. British intellectuals will be the first people to be like, yes, we were the source of all the evil in history, right? But truth is more complicated than that, and guilt and shame, they're unpleasant emotions. But if you can get away from that, from feeling that, by shifting it all onto an acceptable target or acceptable, load bearer for those negative emotions, people are going to do that, and that's what they do when they try and memory hold Jinnah and then center the British Raj as the reason why all of this happened. But it's not true. It's not entirely true. It's only partly true.
So I'm just curious to know this now, because if there was no, there was no force for partition, there was no talks about partition, would the British have left in 1947?
Probably not. I think that there's a lot of factors that went into the British actually leaving. They'd been talking about how they would, we'll leave eventually when you're ready. We'll leave when you're prepared to be your own country and this and that. The truth of the matter is that these European powers never really left just because, it's time. I think we're done making money off of you. It doesn't really work like that. You needed World War II to basically destroy their capacity. All right. You needed the threat. You needed the Quit India movement. You needed riots in India. You needed, there was a lot of rioting that went on as the 40s went on. All right. There was bloodshed going on too. They were acutely aware that they were losing control of the situation, even at the level of communal harmony. All right. There were killings that went on in Noakhali, in Bengal, in Bihar, in the Northwest provinces. There was killing going on even before partition. It wasn't like August 15th, we drew a line, now everyone start killing each other. The British were losing control of the colony, of the British Raj. they had a completely they were exhausted as a country, as a people. They were exhausted by World War II and Hitler. All right. And they were so exhausted that they got rid of Churchill and put in someone who was going to give them, nationalized health care. And basically they put in like a socialist kind of, right after Churchill. They had the arch Tory, and then they basically got rid of him once he had won the war. They're like, okay, your use is, we're done with you. We want someone who's going to help us out now. The British had shifted their mentality entirely. They were no longer a country that wanted to invest blood and treasure in maintaining a cash cow on the other side of the world. Yeah. So would the British have left in 1947? I don't think they would have. And I know that as long as Churchill was in power, they wouldn't have left. Churchill came back to power in Britain shortly after partition of India. After the partition of India, Churchill came back to power. Do you think Churchill in the early 50s would have been like, okay, we're going to leave India? No, they would have continued stringing everyone along. And until things started getting out of hand, and until Hitler and the World War II exhausted them, they were just stringing Indians along, and they were giving them little elections. They were giving them this and that, telling them this and telling them that. Oh, you continue negotiating. Why do you think Indians were negotiating for 30 years with an impasse? And the British were like, oh, well, we definitely can't leave, because you guys can't hammer this out. We can't leave, so there were a lot of, factors that came together to basically uncouple Britain from India. But no, I don't think they would have left on their own. I think that all those factors played into it. Yeah, for sure.
Got it. So, Amit, this has been a great podcast. One last question which we ask to all our guests, which is, it's not even a question, it's just your top 5 recommendations, the book recommendations, or maybe documentary recommendations that people need to watch or read, especially about the topic of partition.
Sure. So at the end of the book, at the end of the novel, I share a bunch of different sources. And so I'll just name some of those sources. Indian Summer by Alex von Tunzelman is great. Midnight's Furies by Nisid Hajari is great. There's a classic, Freedom at Midnight, which is just a great read. I don't know if it's necessarily that highly regarded as a work of historiography or investigation, but it's a wonderful read. And then what I also recommend is going to source material. And that involves reading speeches by Jinnah and Gandhi. And, read essays by Gandhi, read speeches by Jinnah, and read some of the documentary evidence that's very freely available online. And above all, read the cabinet discussions, the cabinet meeting, the cabinet mission discussions, the discussions that Mountbatten had with Jinnah, Mountbatten had with Gandhi. All of those transcripts are available. And those are illuminating, in my opinion, because they push against certain entrenched narratives that people tell themselves to feel better about the partition. And as soon as you do that, things start becoming more complicated and also richer, and also they become deeper. The whole time deepens for you when you first of all read, historical accounts of it, but then go into the transcripts, go into the speeches, go into the documentary evidence at the time. And it's kind of like you're doing the work of historian yourself. But I feel that either one of those two types of material is insufficient on its own to get an understanding of the time.
Got it. So thank you so much, Amit. I'll just show the book again to the people, The Map and the Scissors. You'll find the link in the bio. If you want to know the life story of Jinnah and Gandhi, if you are someone like who wants to imagine how they, used to talk, how they used to dress up, how they used to gather the people around them. So just go ahead, buy this book. It's a really interesting book. And something that has come out for the first time, I think so, about Jinnah and Gandhi together. So yeah, do go ahead and buy this book. Thank you, Amit. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.